I'm thrilled to welcome back Peter Farina, who was with us last summer and also participated in our silent auction last year as well. And we had a great turnout last year when he talked about the complexities of trying to, what I'll define as recapture your Italian citizenship, because we learned from Peter last year that if you are of Italian descent and you've got the right bloodline, you are always an Italian citizen. You just need to claim it. And I thought that was fascinating, since we in the United States live in a birthright country. And so if you're born here, you're an American. And Italy functions quite differently. And you know, we're thrilled to have you back, because after last year's presentation and your talk, we really got inundated with a lot of questions from people. And I know we put people in touch with you. And italyMONDO obviously is a thriving business. And even one of our staff members has worked with you and some of her family members on their Italian citizenship. So I'm going to turn the floor over to you and just thank you for being with us once again.
Oh, thanks, Lisa. I appreciate you having me too. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. I see there's a few names from last time and a lot of new names. So what we can do is we can start with a little bit of Italian Citizenship 101 just to get a base. And if Lisa and everybody has time, I'm more than happy. It's midnight Italian time here, so I'm filled with espresso to stay up, and I'm happy to stay late and answer even direct questions and things like that. So talking about Citizenship 101. A little about us. Like Lisa said, my name's Peter Farina. I'm from upstate New York myself. I'm calling you from Italy, hence why it's midnight. And over 16 years ago, I founded italyMONDO to help other people do the same thing that I attempted to do myself 20 years ago when I was at Syracuse University, to research my family tree, find and meet my long lost family, walking in my ancestors' footsteps, and put an Italian passport in my hand. But it wasn't easy. There was only one company that existed at the time back then, and they unfortunately took advantage of me. Basically got laughed out of the consulate 20 years ago, got stuck in a bus strike in Rome, got pickpocketed in Rome. All these bad things happened to me. But when I finally knocked on that door and my long lost cousins opened it, and I had a photo from my grandmother's attic just with a name and an address on it. And they took me in like my family never left. This entire experience just totally changed my life. So I had this negative kind of experience with nefarious business practices, with the realities of Italian bureaucracy, with the realities of off the beaten path Italy, contrasted with the just amazing transformative experience. And I actually ended up leaving Syracuse University to create italyMONDO because I just wanted to give the same experience that I had to others, because I knew there had to be other people just like me. And like Lisa, thankfully, we've been very blessed. We have 2 brick and mortar offices, 32 full-time employees, and 16 years of experience, and over 5,000 people running around with Italian passports now, thanks to our work. Now, on to the important stuff. Everybody here has some sort of connection to Italy. And we're going to focus on Italian citizenship through descent, but there's actually a few different ways that you can, quote unquote, get citizenship. And I'll explain a little later why there's quotes there in terms of get citizenship. Because one is actually having it recognized through descent. And like Lisa alluded to, you're claiming something that actually already exists. In fact, when you're quote unquote applying for citizenship, for Italian citizenship through descent, literally the one thing you are not doing is applying for Italian citizenship. You are applying for a delayed birth registration though, and rendering a declaration stating that you've always been an Italian citizen rather, in contrast to naturalizing through marriage and naturalizing through residency, as well as reacquisition. If anybody here was born in Italy, maybe came over in the 1960s, 50s, or 60s, naturalized in the 1970s or 80s, the act of acquiring a foreign naturalization, or a foreign citizenship rather, and naturalizing in a foreign country, resulted in the loss of citizenship Italian citizenship until August 15th, 1992. But those people, like let's say somebody naturalized in Brooklyn in 1977, that person can now choose to reacquire Italian citizenship. Now back to citizenship through descent, not everybody that has a vowel at the end of their last name is actually eligible. And Sunda Junta did raise her hand, or Guinta, G-U-I, but I'm assuming it's Junta, a nice Sicilian last name. I'm happy to answer a question if you'd like, Sunda. You can add in the chat. A couple people raised hands. Talking permitted, Junta. Unmute though. Looks like you're up. Josephine, if you'd like to try.
Yeah. So my husband was born in Italy and he had an Italian citizenship. So when he became an American citizenship, he didn't keep his Italian citizenship and he took the American citizenship. So how will it be easier for him the way that, because he had the Italian citizenship?
Not necessarily easier, it's different. They're different procedures. So with somebody like you that, or let's say Junta here, who maybe has Italian roots, it's a recognition of something that technically already exists. And I'll get to the reacquisition in a second. Basically, when Italy unified, so if your ancestor emigrated from Naples in 1847, they actually emigrated as a Neapolitan subject, the subject of the kingdom of the two Sicilies, or kingdom of Naples. It was only after 1861 that Italy existed. Anyways, 1865, they rolled out a new Italian civil code. Title I established everything about Italian citizenship, reestablished things that were already the case in most of Southern Europe. The child of an Italian father is an Italian citizen. If you choose to become a foreign national, you lose Italian citizenship. Anyways, that 1865 civil code came a couple of decades too early because basically you fast forward to the end of the century and what ended up being the largest mass migration of any nationality in human history ended up occurring. So in 1912, the legislators got together to modernize, at the time, Italian citizenship, and they reestablished what was already the case. Child of an Italian father is an Italian citizen who spontaneously acquires a foreign citizenship, loses Italian citizenship. But they added an interesting article that outside of special dispensations stipulated by international agreements, the Italian citizen born and resident abroad that is retained a foreign citizen by birth conserves Italian citizenship. But when they become adult, they can choose to renounce it. We'll talk about that in a second. But to get to your husband, he was an Italian citizen, not because he was born in Italy. In fact, nobody was ever an Italian citizen because they were born in Italy. We have plenty of clients that are born in Italy. Maybe their parents were in the military. The one client just got recognized this week. He was born in Rome, but we had to get his citizenship recognized through his great-grandfather. Because just because you're born in Italy doesn't mean that you're an Italian citizen. That principle is called jus soli, or by right of soil. Italy instead follows the Roman practice of you're sanguinis, or by right of blood. So anyways, this law from 1912 was in effect from July 1st, 1912 to August 15th, 1992. So if your husband chose to become a US citizen, whether as a minor or an adult in the US, the act of becoming an American resulted in the loss of his Italian citizenship, even though he never formally renounced it. The very act of choosing another naturalization resulted in the loss. And reacquisition, which is effectively possible since August 15th, 1992, allows him the ability to reacquire it. There are a few catches, though. It's not retroactive. So if you had, for example, if he had a child, let's say he naturalized in 1980, had a child in 1985, and then reacquired it now. On paper, that child would have been born to an American, not an Italian. And the act of reacquiring it isn't retroactive, so you can't give it to adult children, only minor children. But there is a path that is relatively simplified. It's actually much quicker than Italian citizenship through descent. But the moral of the story, it is possible, and it's fairly straightforward for reacquisition.
So Peter, we're going to let you go on with your talk. And I'm certain that you're going to cover a lot of people's general questions as you go on. And I've just reminded everybody that we are monitoring the chat carefully, and we're going to make sure we get through as many of people's personal questions as possible.
Definitely. And I'm happy to stay late, everybody, after the presentation too, to answer any personal questions as well and get into specifics. So until the espresso wears off, I think I'm at 7 cups for the evening. And so anyways, eligibility through Italian descent. Now, Josephine's husband was an Italian citizen, not because he was born in Italy, but because on his date of birth, his father was an Italian citizen, assumingly. Italy doesn't care where the event occurs, they care to whom it occurs. So if an Italian couple moves to London today and has a child later this year in London, it's as Italian as the child born to the same couple born in Rome. However, an American couple, for example, living in Lucca that has a child, that child is not Italian, it's American. Because Italy doesn't care where the event occurs, they care to whom it occurs. So we have to look back at these life events to dictate eligibility. Because again, not, just because we'll get to Jennifer Curtis here, specific situation, maybe at the end I see her in the chat. But just because she's Jennifer Curti, which obviously is Italian, and doesn't mean that she's necessarily eligible. And then we'll also talk about the Italian X factor of viability, because anybody that's dealt with Italian bureaucracy knows that the legal right to do something in Italy and the ability to actually succeed at it are two very different things. And we'll talk about that in a second. But anyways, base eligibility requirements is that A, you have an ancestor that emigrated from the unified Kingdom of Italy. We have plenty of clients that have C's and H's at the end of their last name because their ancestors emigrated from what is now Croatia or Slovenia, but they emigrated between World War I and World War II when that area was part of Italy. And we have plenty of people that couldn't become clients who are culturally, ethnically, linguistically Italian, but their ancestor emigrated from, let's say, Trento in 1913, let's say, and that area wasn't Italian, it was Austro-Hungarian. So the first and most important requirement is, did your ancestor emigrate from Italy? The only survivor of Custard's last stand was an Italian bugle player, and his descendants are not eligible because he emigrated from the Italian peninsula before Italy even existed. Now, the next thing is, did that person have Italian citizenship when the child was born? Now, Josephine brought up a very specific case. My husband was born in Italy. Now, she may be Italian herself, but if you're looking at, if she's not, and her husband's the only one with Italian connection, let's say, if the act of him becoming a US citizen resulted in the loss of Italian citizenship, not according to the American laws in place at the time, but according to the Italian laws, Article 8 of Law 555 of June 13th, 1912, who spontaneously acquires a foreign nationality loses Italian citizenship. And that law was not in effect until 1912, July 1st, 1912. So although there's lots of different loopholes, different niche cases and things like that, the base requirement is, did the ancestor emigrate from the unified Kingdom of Italy? Did they have Italian citizenship at the time of their child's birth in America? And did they keep that citizenship until after this law was in effect in 1912? Now, there's tons of niche cases. We have, one client in San Francisco that had her citizenship recognized through her Polish mother. How is that possible? Well, women who married Italian men prior to April 27th, 1983, automatically became Italian citizens because a married woman could not assume a citizenship different than that of her husband. So this client's dad became a US citizen before she was born. Game over, right? Well, he became a citizen before she was born, but after he married his wife. So his wife automatically became a citizen in 1961, it was. And as a result, we had her citizenship recognized through marriage. And then she transmitted that citizenship to the child. So there's more than one way to skin a cat. But the base requirement is this. Did somebody come from the Unified Kingdom of Italy? Did they have citizenship when that child was born? And did they have it until after 1912? Here's my own great-grandfather's naturalization record, Frank Galeazza, unfortunately, in the US. And you can see here that on June 7th, 1927, he chose to become an American, proudly so. In June of 1927, he lost his Italian citizenship, but my grandfather, as well as my Aunt Nikki and Uncle Dominic, who died in the war, they were born with Italian citizenship, technically, because they were born on American soil, jus soli, they're accidental Americans. And on their date of birth, 1922, in the case of my grandpa, he was born to an Italian father who unknowingly transmitted citizenship to him. Now, that's eligibility. The legal right to apply pertains to the applicant. Then there's little things that pertain to the viability of an application, that Italian X factor. You know, go to the Italian post office, DMV, or just anywhere in Italy and try to do something. It's always, you know, your ability to do it and your legal right to do it, two different things. So here's my great-grandfather's naturalization, Frank Galeazza. He was born Francesco, obviously, Francesco Antonio, actually. And he was a citizen when my grandpa Nick was born. Well, let's look at my grandpa's birth certificate here. You can see that Nicolangelo Michele Galeazza was born on September 29, 1922 to Frank Galeazza. And then you can see during the war, the week that he enlisted, he got his birth certificate, saw, like so many children of Italian immigrants, he was born with an Italian name, and actually amended it. That's the exception, not the rule. People add confirmation names as middle names. They assume Americanized names. Under common law, you can assume any alias you want, and that becomes your legal name as long as you do it without malicious intent. But Italy's legal system isn't based on common law. It's based on civil law, and they don't recognize these common law principles. For example, if you were born to your parents in a common law union, and they had 7 kids in this union, they just never got married. They were just a common law union, and your father's name is on your birth certificate, the US recognizes that he's the father. Italy doesn't. You have to get an affirmation of paternity or a confirmation of paternity for that. Anyways, things like this, that Nicolangelo Michele Galeazza was on the birth certificate, that pertains to the viability of the application. And there's ways to address that even if they didn't do it when they were alive. Viability is a bit more binary, though. Was the dad Italian? And was his child born at the time of his before he naturalized? And did that child have foreign citizenship, jus soli, by right of soil? If so, they were born with citizenship. Nick passed it on to my mom, passed it on to me. And in fact, you can see my Italian birth certificate here. On the left, you see Peter Michael Farina, March 15th, 1984, Amsterdam, New York, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And on the right, you see Peter Michael Farina, March 15th, 1984, Amsterdam, New York, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't 20 years ago apply for Italian citizenship. I declared that I was an Italian citizen from birth and then proved that. And then they registered me in this global database of Italian citizens called AIRE that we'll talk about in the end. And they transcribed my birth certificate specifically in Part 2, Series B of the birth registry. So there's these big dusty ledgers, ledger-sized books, 11 by 16. And there's a section, Part 2, Series B, for all the births that occurred in your ancestral town, or rather to citizens of your ancestral town abroad. Because again, Italy doesn't care where the event occurs, they care to whom it occurs. So anyways, the logic flow is, okay, I'm married to an Italian. I have Italian ancestry, whatever. Am I eligible through that specific means? Is there any viability concerns? If not, there's two parts to any process. With us, another company, on your own, regardless of citizenship type, you have to prepare the records, part one, and then present those records, part two. And there's no right or wrong answer how you prepare and where you present. So, but whether somebody, presents it in this manner or not, you're basically trying to figure out, okay, am I going to do the records DIY on my own with some sort of structured assistance, or am I going to have somebody do it for me? And then once I prepare, regardless of how or with whom, where am I going to present it? Now, if everybody here is in the tri-state area, they can be, if they're traditionally eligible, they can present the application through their local consulate, New York. You can also expedite it and apply directly in Italy. And if the New York waiting list gets any bigger, they're denying you a right. And you can even pursue through the courts. And the courts are also very common too if you're pursuing through maternal lineage. Although there's lots and lots and lots of misconceptions on that. And we can talk about that more too. Now, again, prepare the records on your own with help. Have somebody take care of it for you. Present your local consulate, which is jurisdiction based. Like LA is only booking 3 months out. San Francisco, in terms of Italian consulates, the Italian consulate in San Francisco, the next available appointments are in the end of 2026. Same state, same laws, 2 different management processes. And so somebody in San Francisco that's living in Oakland, and so they're in the San Francisco consulate's jurisdiction, they can't just apply in LA where the appointment waits are only 3 months out, because when you apply at the consulate, you're not only saying that I'm an Italian citizen, here's the proof, you're saying I'm an Italian citizen legally living in your Italian consulate's jurisdiction. So in fact, you present proof of residency and a US passport or a green card, because if you're Italian and you don't have a passport or a US passport or a green card, you can't legally live in that consulate's jurisdiction as an Italian. So the US passport is almost a requirement for applying for Italian citizenship through descent. Anyways, we'll talk when we get into the one-on-one questions, we can talk more about the different application methods and timelines and processes. But regardless, anybody thinking about Italian citizenship is looking at these 5 stages. You're going to collect these records, then you're going to correct discrepancies in those records. You're going to legalize them for foreign use with something called an apostille. We'll talk about that in a second. Translate everything into Italian, and when necessary, authenticate those translations. Now, that's a bunch of gibberish. Let's look at my great-grandfather's naturalization again. So this here, I'm from upstate New York. This naturalization was certified by the county clerk in Montgomery County. And that's because my great-grandfather naturalized in the Supreme Court of New York in Fonda, New York, which is Montgomery County. So this certificate was acquired. There was no amendments to be had. You can't amend naturalization records, but it does have to be legalized for foreign use with something called an apostille. Now, all that is a simplification of the legalization process that used to exist prior to the apostille agreement of the Hague Convention. If you wanted to use a New York City birth certificate in Italy 60 years ago, you would have to first acquire that record. There's a process of getting it with what's called a letter of exemplification. It's authenticated and so on and so forth. But you would bring that letter, more importantly, you would bring that certificate, I should say, to the Italian consulate, who verifies that it's valid and legalizes that for use in Italy. And that record now can only be used in Italy. Instead, back in the 60s, everybody got together and said, listen, this is complicated. If you guys say the document is valid, we'll accept it. So Germany, the US, Australia, the UK, Italy, they all got together and said, okay, if your Minister of Foreign Affairs, or in our case, the Secretary of State, says that it's a valid document, you don't need to go to our consulate. You don't need to legalize it there. Honor system, it's ready to go. That's what an apostille is. It's a separate, let's call it certification. The official term is called a legalization of a record to render this American record valid for use in Italy. So again, you collect the records, you correct errors on those records, legalize everything for foreign use with an apostille, translate English language records into Italian, and when needed, authenticate those translations as valid. The New York City consulate, for example, requires an authentication of any translations of court records, unique to court records. The only consulate that wants that. In the end, it's their world, we're just living in it though. That's why there's 10 Italian consulates in the US. There's 10 timelines for appointment waits, 10 timelines for processing time, and 10 requirements on how you prepare the records. And again, that's because the consulate network is jurisdiction based. If you live in Camden, you apply in Philly. If you live in Newark, you apply in New York. If you live in Las Vegas, you apply in LA. Now, all those are the consulates that are closest to those cities. But if you live in Reno, Nevada, you're a hell of a lot closer to San Francisco than you are to LA, but you have to apply in LA because the state of Nevada is under the jurisdiction of LA. It's why somebody in Anchorage, Alaska, or Honolulu, prior to COVID, had to fly to San Francisco to apply because they're under that consulate's jurisdiction. And as many of you might already know, it is quite the long process, and your timeline is dictated by appointment wait plus processing time. They legally have up to 2 years to process you. New York's actually exceeding that 2-year limit, so there's a process to actually legally have it done quicker at that point, filing something called a DeFida. We can talk about that in the future if anybody's in that process waiting for New York. But there is an appointment wait, and New York has a nice big waiting list. And if anybody's thinking about citizenship and is not yet on that waiting list, definitely get on the waiting list. And I can show the site how to do that at the end of the call as well. But anyways, appointment wait plus processing time is your total timeline. And to breeze through some of the misconceptions so we can get in the Q&A. Biggest misconception is that you're applying for citizenship. It's literally the one thing you're not doing when it's through descent. Another one is, oh, my kids can't get it because, I'm the last line. There's no generational limit. In fact, it's the only derivative citizenship in Europe that has no generational limit. And then many people think they can't apply if they're applying through their mom. That's not really the case. What matters, let's go back to my grandpa's naturalization. So my grandpa was born in 1922 in America prior to his dad losing his Italian citizenship. So Nick, being an accidental American, received citizenship unknowingly and passed it on to my mom. My mom, a female, could pass it on to me because women gained the same rights as men when the modern Italian Constitution was set up and went into effect on January 1st, 1948 during the Reconstruction. Now, my Aunt Nikki here, Nicolina Galeazza there, she too was born when her father was an Italian citizen. And her children, even though she's female, are all eligible because she, a female, gave birth after 1948, after the year that women gained the same rights as men. And this is a point of confusion even for professionals. This morning, literally this morning, there was somebody that booked a consultation with me who's applying on his own in Pozzuoli, which is in the greater Naples area. And he's applying through his mother, and he was born in the 60s. And the town didn't want him to apply because they said, no, your mom was born in 1948, so you're not eligible. The town hall didn't even understand it. It's not, and in fact, luckily we clarified it, and I gave them the wording so they can go back to the town, then a government circular clarifying it. So it's not going to be an issue for them. But even the town hall sent them packing. In the end, it's not when a female is born, it's when a female gives birth that allows the transmission of Italian citizenship through a female. Now, passport, a lot of people equate citizenship with a passport. A passport is like voting. It's a privilege of citizenship. You don't have to request a passport. You don't have to vote. But there's things that you can do once your citizenship is recognized. But citizenship first, and then a passport. You don't know how many people contact us and say, I want my Italian passport. We had a request once, I remember, that said, I don't want my Italian citizenship, I just want my Italian passport. Kind of tough to do that. And then a lot of people come to us and say, well, I'm eligible because my parents were born in Italy. Or I'm Italian, I was born in Italy. Or I still got a house, I go back every year, I know Zio Luigi, so on and so forth. In the end, it doesn't matter if it's your great-great-great-great-grandpa or your dad. You look at that snapshot in time. Was that person an Italian citizen? Was this person born on, in this case, American soil? And on this date, was he still an Italian citizen? And if he naturalized in the US, he wasn't an Italian citizen anymore. So we have plenty of people that call us and say, hey, my so-and-so referred me. He applied through his great-great-grandfather. I'd like to do the same thing. And we have to tell him that he's not eligible because when he was born in 1962, his dad already became a citizen in the 50s. So on paper, that person who is more culturally connected with Italy than maybe that great-great-grandchild is not eligible because on paper, on that snapshot in time, he, although born to a father who was culturally, ethnically, linguistically Italian, on paper was American. Article 8. Who spontaneously acquires a foreign citizenship loses Italian citizenship. Now, common concerns that luckily aren't. Italy is like most countries, they only tax resident income, resident assets. The US, on the other hand, is one of the handful of countries that tax global income. There's no military requirement. The Italian Selective Service Program was dismantled almost 2 decades ago. There's no oath when you apply through descent. You're not because again, you're not applying for citizenship. So there's no oath to take. You've always been Italian. You're just documenting it. You're an undocumented Italian citizen in the case of recognition through descent. And then finally, both Italy and the US recognize multiple citizenships. The US recognizes it due to Supreme Court decisions. Italy recognizes it specifically because it was codified in 1992. And then there are some obligations as an Italian citizen. You do have to keep your registration up to date, letting the consulate know where you're living, contact information, so on and so forth. And if you're married, divorced, have a child, you do have to keep those registrations up to date. Again, you do a delayed birth registration, and then you have to keep your municipality actually in Italy. Like if your ancestor came from Caserta, you will have a birth certificate in Caserta, and when you get married, you have to submit that to Caserta for registration through the consulate. When you have a child, so on and so forth. And you also keep them posted on changes in address, because although maybe you'll change consulates, you move from New York to Florida, you're always registered with your ancestral town. In fact, as an Italian citizen living abroad, you can vote in your ancestral town's mayoral election. Believe it or not, you just have to go in person and you're allowed to vote because you're as a citizen of that town than anybody else. You just weren't documented for a few decades. And Lisa, I don't know what you would like to do here, but I'm happy to take questions and get to
Sure. So I think you clarified a couple of questions. Somebody had asked whether it mattered whether it was maternal or paternal sides of the family. I think you've addressed that, but if the person still has any doubts, they should feel free to write into the chat and we'll
Talking about
try
a
to
father's
clarify it
father
further.
or mother's father doesn't make a difference. No, what matters is, so you can apply through mother's side. I'm actually eligible through all three of my four great-grandparents. Both of my mother's grandfathers, who became citizens after my my mother's parents were respectively born, and also through my father's paternal grandfather, who never became a U.S. citizen. Now, the misconception is that whole 1948 thing. So another way to simplify this idea is draw a line between you and whoever came from Italy in your ancestry. And you might have multiple people. You might have 3 great-grandpas and 2 great-grandmas. Draw a line between you and them. It could just be your parent, could be a great-grandparent, great-great, or records great-great-great. And then look at that line and see if there's any females that gave birth prior to 1948. So let's say if your mother's father, and assuming you're a strapping young lad of less than 70, your mother's father's, so we're talking about a maternal grandfather, was he born in Italy as an Italian citizen? Okay. Did he emigrate on an Italian passport? Okay. Did he have your mom in Brooklyn, if you're Sicilian, or Calabrese if it was in the Bronx? Yes. On that date of your mom's birth, was your maternal grandfather still an Italian citizen? Well, you may not know. There's ways that we can look at that too, even live if you'd like. But if he was, he gave citizenship to your mom, who was an accidental American. The Italians viewed your mom as his anchor baby of sorts. Wasn't her fault that she's American. She received citizenship, and assuming she gave birth to you after 1948, passed it on to you. Because this law was in effect until 1992. However, you can see a little annotation here on the law. It's because the original article says the child of an Italian father is an Italian citizen, and the child of an unmarried woman is an Italian citizen. And then it was, there was a 1975 and 1983 Supreme Court, Constitutional Court rulings, which is actually different than the Supreme Court here, with subsequent legislation that repealed this portion of the law and rewrote it to say the child of an Italian parent is an Italian citizen. However, it was only retroactive to the Constitution being implemented. And we only helped set that up during the Reconstruction and going into effect on January 1st, 1948. And so I know that's a little convoluted without any charts, but hopefully that makes sense.
Well, and one good question that somebody asked was, what if one of the family members for whom Italian citizenship is sought is an adopted family member? Does adoption change how any of this plays out?
That's a great question. So the good news is that whether you were adopted into an Italian family, or even if your mother, for example, was adopted into an Italian family, or adopted out of an Italian family, citizenship is both given and preserved, because being adopted out of an Italian family was of no choice of your own. Let's say your somebody's father was born to an Italian family, and they were given up for adoption and adopted into a non-Italian family, and that child didn't choose to be given up for adoption. So the Italian government says that if you can prove, and also New York State now is an open record state to see your pre-adoption birth certificate. That law changed about a year and a half ago. So you can actually get your pre-adoption mother, for example, pre-adoption birth certificate and show that you're connected to that Italian family. And then the process is the same. Same goes for if you're adopted into an Italian family, in which case you are treated as a biological child. Now, there's some practical things that occur, like the adoption gets recognized through the minors tribunal in Italy. So there's like a secondary process, but for the end user, it's all automated. It just adds a little bit of time.
And then somebody else had a question about how to get documents amended, which I'm assuming is different for every single document and what the circumstances are. But I know that some common things, and you talked about this a bit last year. I mean, sometimes people's middle initial or middle name comes and goes from their official documents over time, or even slight, inadvertent changes in spelling of names, or, if you're, I don't know, Di Giovanni, and some people squish that together. Some people have a space between the D and the Giovanni. And so sometimes these inconsistencies in records can cause problems. And I know last year you spoke a little bit about the process in general terms for amending these documents, which is probably time and patience, but.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a couple different schools of thought in how you amend and what you amend, and if you even can amend the records. So one thing, so Adina DeLuca wrote a question here, and we'll get to your question specifically, but I can guarantee that Dina DeLuca's driver's license, for example, is DeLuca, no space. And her US passport says DeLuca with a space, and she signs her name, big D, little e, no space, big L, Luca. And you can prove me wrong if that's not the case. Obviously, there's always exceptions. But that specific thing with what's called a patronymic surname. So quick detour. In the 1500s, the Council of Trent got together and said, all right, guys, we got to figure out these things about the church and what we do in Christendom. And they made church records obligatory, like records of the sacraments, so baptismal records, things like that. That's why we have church records for genealogy, etc. We can talk about that too. And the other thing they did in the Council of Trent was to establish last names even for poor contadini or peasant folk like us. So Dina DeLuca here is what's called a patronymic surname, because a Ferrari is given based on, Joe Ferrari, his ancestor's name was based on being a blacksmith. Farina worked with flour. DeLuca is what's called a patronymic surname. Hey, I'm looking for Tony. Which Tony? Tony DeLuca, son of Luca. O'Patrick is a patronymic surname, so on and so forth. Then you also get toponymic surnames too. I'm looking for Vito Genovese, or Vito, which one? The guy from Genoa, Vito Genovese. That's a toponymic surname. But anyways, Dina DeLuca's is a common name that gives the Italians fits because the space is a legal character. So as you start to acquire all these records, Dina's birth, marriage, her parents' births, marriage, deaths, you're going to see DeLuca spelled in a million different ways. And that's outside of, Antonio being born Antonio, later going by Anthony, shows up as Tony on his death certificate. And by the way, he took Joseph as his confirmation name. So now he added a middle name, what's called by use under common law. And you'll get 5 records that have your grandfather's name on it. Let's say Grandpa Tony's birth, marriage, death, and your mom's birth and marriage. So 5 records that have Grandpa Tony's name. And we're going to see it as Antonio, Anthony, Anthony J, Tony, Tony J. You're going to see it on 5 different ways. Now, whether that's an issue or not is a different story. A consulate like Boston has an aneurysm over discrepancies, while a consulate like Detroit could care less, as long as it doesn't pertain to what's called the applicant generation. So talking about that, when you present all these records to the consulate, you put them into 2 different buckets. There's your own birth and marriage. That's part of what we call the applicant generation. It's the stuff that's actually getting sent to Italy to be transcribed. Again, you're applying for delayed birth, marriage registration, so on and so forth. And then there's the ancestral generation, which just stays at the consulate and nobody even sees it. In fact, the town in Italy has no idea who my grandfather is. They don't even see it. So some consulates like Boston are very strict. Historically, New York has been, although they've gotten much more flexible under the current management. And a consulate like Detroit couldn't care less that Nicolangelo Michele Galeazza became on other records, regardless of this correction here. became another name. In the end, it's subjective. So ancestral records, subjectively, you address these discrepancies. The applicant generation, like your own birth and marriage, objectively, that needs to be fixed because that's the stuff getting registered in Italy. And then two, let's see here. To Alexis' question, how you amend records, that really changes state to state. So for example, if you were married in New York City, the marriage record is held with the New York City clerk. And if you want to amend the record, both you and your husband have to, for example, present proof, generally your birth certificates, and also both sign off on the amendment. But if that record, if it's your grandfather's marriage certificate that occurred, let's say before 1948, that's held with the New York City Municipal Archives, and that can't be amended anymore. Births and deaths that occur within the city are held with the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And there's specific requirements to amend, like let's say you want to correct your parents' name on your birth certificate. You have to present their parents or their own birth certificate. For example, say, this is my mother, here's the proof, and then correct it to say that. But if they died on Long Island, that record is held with the New York State Department of Health if it occurred outside of the 5 boroughs. And that record gets amended in Albany, depending on, and then again, you provide proof, an affidavit, meeting certain requirements, and then you amend them. And then New York does something called an inline correction, not to get too in the weeds, where they actually cross out the info and say, nope, this is the right info, as opposed to in New Jersey, which does something called an interlineation, where you present an affidavit and the proof, and to Trenton, the New Jersey Department of Health in this case, and then they attach the record to the original record and says, item 2 should read as this. That's called an interlineation. Bit in the weeds, but it's a record by record basis. You know, a Pennsylvania marriage is amended through the clerk of orphans court, but a Maryland marriage is done through the circuit court. New Jersey marriage is done through the New Jersey Department of Health, and Massachusetts marriages, you can't amend at all unless you can prove that it's a true heir.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, trying to, you know, in some instances, put a couple of questions together. But, you know, one question that one of the participants asked, which is an interesting one, what if you regain your citizenship, but your ancestral town is no longer in Italy, which, you know, we don't think of borders changing in recent times, but in fact, in the early decades of the 20th century, European borders did change, including Italy's. And then there are places like, you know, Ethiopia and Eritrea, and briefly Albania, and even parts of Greece that were at times in the early 20th century part of Italy and are no longer. So you could have been born in Albania during the brief period it was under Italian occupation. And where does that leave you as your citizenship?
That's a great question. And your records are, so like, let's say your grandfather was of Croatian or descent, and your ancestral town is actually now, was in the former province of Pola, and which is now Croatia. Your birth certificate, when your citizenship is recognized, actually gets sent to Rome in that case for registration. You technically have the right to opt for any place where you want your birth certificate to be registered. The consulates don't allow you to choose anymore, although technically you have the legal right to do so. But in that specific case, if the town no longer exists, like if that area is no longer Italy, it does get sent to Rome. Very niche situation, but something that comes up nonetheless. Best case scenario.
And then, you know, a lot of people have, you know, questions about their particular circumstances of people being born in the US, but never got naturalized, you know, born to people who never became citizens. You know, I think you've answered a lot of that. One one question that a few people have asked, and I don't want us to get too into the weeds on this, because people can follow up with you at italymondo.com/get started if they want to have, a free discovery call and figure out if they're good candidates to move forward with you. But just in very broad terms, people who have complexities are going to obviously have more expenses, but in general terms, is there a kind of average, both in terms of time and money? Michelle Santoro, who's on our staff, worked with you when she and her father were seeking Italian citizenship, and because of COVID, their dates for their interviews kept changing, and in fact, hers ended up getting scheduled finally on the worst day possible, as she was about to board a plane to leave, the country briefly. So, it's a complex process. And, is there a kind of average time that people should expect start to finish?
Sure. So what we often tell people is, unless they're expediting directly in Italy, and to parlay that into Roberto Alessandra's, it's not that the law has been changed. You've always been able to apply directly in Italy. And it's not that you have to apply in your ancestral town. Legally, you can apply anywhere in Italy. And they simply simplified the process in 2007 to allow you to do that. But it's not specific to your ancestral town. But unless you apply directly in Italy, like Roberto's question is about, realistically, we like to say that it's about a 3 to 5 year process, best and worst case scenarios. It really depends on your consulate. Now, San Francisco, and this is why, and as Lisa alluded to, we offer free discovery calls for anybody. Feel free to book a call, speak with it. It's totally obligation free, no costs, etc. And we can talk at high levels. The team members can talk on high levels about costs with us, and also on your own. Our process is really about educating people and pointing them in the right direction, even if that's not us. So anyways, the timelines are incredibly dictated by, excluding COVID and everything else, by the consulates. So for example, San Francisco is booking the end of 2026. But currently, they're processing applications presented 6 months ago. Really fast processing time, really slow appointment wait. LA is booking 3 months out. So you don't even have the time to get the records in order. You have to wait until your record's in order and then book. But they take over a year to process you. So no matter how you slice and dice it, it's rarely more than 5 years. But unless you're expediting in Italy, it's rarely less than 3 years. There has been a change in law for those that either want to or need to apply through the courts in Italy. It goes into effect in exactly 3 weeks. On June 22nd, court petitions for recognition of citizenship will no longer be presented in Rome. So everybody and their brother in Australia, Brazil, Italy, and otherwise, US and otherwise, would all present in Rome, where the respondent is the Minister of Interior. Now, starting at the end of this month, your petitions will be presented through your ancestral tribunal of jurisdiction. So if somebody's from Lucca, for example, then that goes to the Lucca Tribunale Civile. If somebody's from Naples, so on and so forth. My ancestors were from a town called Guardia Reggia in the province of Campobasso. If I did a court case, for example, that would be presented in a little tribunal here in the region of Molise. The idea was to speed up the process by distributing the caseload through multiple courts instead of just one. So it's to be determined how long court cases are going to be. But even that, there's an appeals period that takes up to 6 months, registration of the records in your ancestral town, the registration with the consulate and something called AIRE, this AIRE thing that you'll see, this global registry of Italian citizens, passport waits. Anyways, you slice and dice it. It's rarely less than 3, rarely more than 5. 4, give or take, is kind of just your average, your average process, your average timeline. Although it is getting slower as Italian citizenship is getting more popular, with few exceptions, LA being one of them.
I am just scrolling through the questions right now to make sure we've answered everybody. And And
This is a good question from Antonio Calabro. The city of birth dictate where the apostille has to be obtained. So there's a couple golden rules of apostilles. Wherever the record was issued, that state's Secretary of State apostilles the records. So the golden rule is if you have a New York birth, but you're living in Florida, so many people send that New York birth to the Florida Secretary of State. Jurisdiction for legalization is not based on the applicant. It's based on the record. So, for example, if you get let's say you're ancestor naturalized in the Southern District Court of New York in Manhattan, you'd say, well, that's a New York record. I'll apostille it in New York. It's not. It's actually a federal record because they hold federal naturalizations, and the National Archives is a federal record or a federal agency. So that record gets apostilled by the U.S. Secretary of State. And if you just Google U.S. Secretary of State apostille, you can see the appropriate office. If you change that to, it's actually very, it's a festival coming up as of today for the last 58 minutes in Italy. It's been a festival. It's the Festa della Repubblica. So anyways, you can change this to New York Secretary of State. And the New York Secretary of State has jurisdiction over New York records. Massachusetts, you'll see a reoccurring trend here. Massachusetts Secretary of State. And the number one rule of apostille is wherever the record came from, that state's Secretary of State apostilles it. And then there's a couple other golden rules. In the envelope goes the application form, payment, the records themselves, and a return envelope. Every single apostille legalization office has the same procedure. Give me my state's records along with payment, a cover letter, the application form, and a return envelope. If you send an apostille request to Florida with New York records, they'll reject it. Florida records in New York, they'll reject it. Hopefully that makes sense.
so I think, again, just order of magnitude, because everybody's circumstances are different. If people embark on this, and let's just take two scenarios. Their records are impeccable. These are the best records you've ever seen in your life. I mean, is somebody looking at typically $1,000 in fees, $5,000 in fees?
Well, they vary from, so we offer services, for example, for consultations at $500 to create action plans and actually designing exactly what records you need to get from where for whom, to turnkey services that start at $12,000. That getting to one person's question here, can I apply with family members? That's actually one of the best ways to save, because then you can divvy up the pie among multiple people. It's actually why applying through the courts are very popular among big families, because maybe you live in San Francisco, your brother lives in New York, and your mom lives in Florida. Well, all of a sudden that means 3 different citizenship portfolios, 3 different sets of records presented through 3 different Italian consulates on 3 different timelines with 3 different requirements, as opposed to 2 brothers and a mother all living in Brooklyn that are going through the same Italian consulate with the same single set of records, so on and so forth. That's why quotes are so hard to say for different families, because 3 brothers living in 3 different consulate jurisdictions is a totally different animal than 3 brothers living in the same consulate jurisdiction. So it's not so much like the generations. That really doesn't have, that does. Some of the most difficult cases we've ever done were through parents, and some of the easiest have been through great-grandparents. So the generations don't really play a role in the difficulty of a case. It's your consulate jurisdiction and some other factor, where the records are coming from, how many, somebody that was born in New York but is now in Florida but lived in California but got divorced in Phoenix, Arizona. That's a hell of a lot harder than just somebody that stayed on 18th Avenue their whole life, which is very convenient. In fact, people that are New York City born and bred I've lived on the same house in 18th Avenue for 3 generations. If they got the time, sometimes it's a little better to go DIY. And that's where, for example, an action plan and document reviews and stuff like that are a little more appropriate and more cost effective. Do plan on €300 application fee at the consulate. That's one thing you can't escape from. And do plan on, $800 to $2,000 worth of documentation costs, depending on how many records, where they're coming from. Another great example on that is if you were born in New York, you get the record apostilled in New York. The New York Secretary of State charges $10 for an apostille. If you were born in Connecticut, the Connecticut Secretary of State charges $40 for an apostille. And if you were born in Illinois, they charge $2. And if you were born in Indiana, they're free. Same exact work, different family tree dictating different unique expenses for your individual case. That's why we custom quote everybody, and also why we provide free discovery calls as well, because then it gives you the opportunity to speak with a human, cut through all the misinformation that's out there, and then actually talk more specifics for you, because it is incredibly unique, each individual case.
Well, I am mindful of how late it is in Italy, and I can't believe that we actually forgot it was Festa della Repubblica. We should have started our evening with acknowledging that important date. I know that people want to get on with their evening, so I'm going to say again that your website is italyMONDO, and for people who want to follow up with you, they should definitely go to the website and book the discovery consultation with you. And I think we just have to have you back every year, because I don't think we're running out of questions.
Yeah, that's for sure.
And I think, I'm going to plant the seed that I think, in addition to citizenship, one of the other things that we should talk about at a future date is, Italy has instituted a lot of programs in recent years to encourage people to not only get their citizenship, but kind of reestablish a lifeline in Italy, whether it's the retirement program that was announced a couple of years ago, where if you could prove you were a retiree and you settled in Italy, there were certain tax breaks for you as a foreigner. And then obviously the €1 house program has gotten a lot of airplay, and it comes with the opportunity to have hundreds of thousands of dollars in restoration charges, but you get your house for €1. And I think there's a lot about some of the incentive programs that Italy has that is not just about regaining citizenship, but really trying to get people to connect economically in Italy, but also have a different kind of experience than just being a tourist in some instances. So,
sure.
Well, if you think there's anything we didn't ask that we should have, let us know. I think we covered everybody's question, and we can't wait to talk to you again.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Just a couple quick questions, because I see the same ones. Can't put siblings on the application. If anybody's thinking about it, make sure you get individual appointments for each individual adult. The only consulate that does family applications is LA. So Josephine Todaro and Kathy Sliv. Make sure that everybody that's thinking about citizenship all has their own appointments. And then to Donald Rinaldi, the Philadelphia consulate, Philadelphia is currently not booking appointments. It's been over 2 years. They are giving appointments to people that got appointments canceled due to COVID, because unfortunately, if you had an appointment booked on a Tuesday or a Thursday, Philly canceled your appointment. They're now giving cancellations to those people, and we're expecting them to open up in Philly. Just remember that it takes a surprisingly long amount of time to get all the records in order correctly. So don't let a New York City waiting list or a Philadelphia, no appointment situation block you. Records first, then the application, and to do the records right, it takes a significantly long time. New York State, for example, to get a birth certificate out of Albany, they're currently processing at 7 to 9 months just to get records out of Albany. So get started now if you're looking for citizenship, and get on New York City's waiting list if anybody's in the tri-state area.
Great. Well, I think we'll say buonanotte. and maybe see you next summer again. So
I'll look forward to it.
all right. Thanks again, everybody. Bye-bye.